So Evan is an Aristotelian. Oh, we're live now.
I love Morpheus.
Yeah. Hi, Facebook. Continue, and then I'll introduce us a little bit.
Eric is platonic, so something like that.
Y'all have a platonic relationship. That's what everyone just heard on Theology on Facebook. That's funny.
Substance dualist, and yeah, he's a hylomorphist. I will be debating Chris Date, who is a Christian physicalist, on the soul in November.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Facebook Live, if you're listening, if you've caught us, we're joined by Eric Hernandez. We're going to be talking about the soul. Does it exist? How do you know? What is it? What's it about? Why does it matter? We are just getting ready and finishing our last minute chatting before we actually hit record. But if you have questions, put them in the comments. Play nice. Don't be mean. I think that's pretty good for what we need to do. I am recording, and then I'm going to set my little timer, and then I think we'll be good. Let's see. Everybody ready to go?
Yeah. Right. I'm going to share this as well really quick, but yep, whenever you're ready.
Do humans have a soul, or is that just an outdated, sentimental way of understanding personality and memories? If the soul is something different from just an emergent property of the mind, then where did it come from? And why does it matter? Can you be an atheist and believe in the soul? Or can you be a Christian and not? We're going to be talking about all of that and much more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Welcome back to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone, Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC, joined by my co-host, Evan McClanahan, Senior Pastor over at First Lutheran in Houston and Midtown. And we are joined today by Eric Hernandez. Eric is the full-time apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. He directs and organizes the unapologetic evangelism conferences throughout the state of Texas, as well as providing evangelism training in apologetics to churches and engaging in formal public debates with atheists, skeptics, and non-believers on various platforms, which a lot of which can be found on his YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Eric Hernandez. But we'll give you that information again at the end of the podcast. But I'm excited about our conversation today. For those of you that are maybe joining us for the first time, Theology on Air is born out of a ministry called Theology on Tap, which is for young adults in Houston. And now in the age of everything being on Zoom, it's really for every age and every area. And we drink craft beer and we talk about cool stuff about culture and faith and philosophy and the Bible and Christian living and all of that kind of stuff. So if you ever have questions about that kind of stuff, come and join us at Theology on Tap. We meet once a month. And then every week we dive deeper into some of those questions. That's what we're going to be doing today. So Eric, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And you're on mute, but I'm going to ask you to unmute because I would love to just have you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you even became interested in this topic. Because this is kind of like your baby topic. It's the thing you most love to talk about, right?
Yes, indeed it is.
So how
did
that
the soul of my ministry.
Oh boy, here we go. Well, I'm going to keep a count of dad jokes. That's one. I know there's more coming.
Oh, absolutely. So to be brief, freshman year of college, I take my first philosophy class as a kind of a blow-off class. I just needed to fill in an elective. Found out later my professor was an atheist, but I was intrigued. I loved it because at church I'd get in trouble for asking questions. And in this class, they're saying, ask all the questions you'd like. Second semester, I wanted to take another philosophy class. And everyone warned me if I did to not take Professor Pena's class because I could lose my faith. And my thought was, sign me up, you know, not because I wanted to lose my faith, of course, but because I was genuinely curious and had my own questions. And I knew that if Christianity is true, I needed to know why. But if it were not true, I'd still like to know why. And maybe this is a guy for the job. So the pivotal day for me was he walks into class and he reaches into his pocket like he pulls out a pill. And he says, now religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And according to Christianity, it's immaterial. And it's because of this we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have passed away. He said, but if the soul exists, according to Christianity, it's where your emotions and feelings and moods lie, and these are immaterial. But how is it that if I took this antidepressant pill, how can something tiny and physical have the power to affect the alleged immaterial? because every time we look at the brain, would you see neurons firing? Every time we look at the body, would you see these base chemical elements, hydrogen, oxygen, things like that, but you don't find a soul. So how do we explain this? And he said, well, the answer is simple. It's because there is no soul, there is no God, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no afterlife. We're just a brain and body, a physical brain and body, and we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives. Class dismissed pretty much. Now, here was for the first time in my life. First of all, I had never met anyone that didn't believe in the soul, much less someone give an objection to it. And for the first time, I hear an objection that, if true, would mean Christianity was false. I say that because Paul said, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then our hope's in vain. Christianity is not true. Well, by the same token, if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection, and therefore Christianity would be false. And I know there are other views on that, but I would say that's what I would hold to. And I had heard lots of complaints against Christianity, but to me, that's what they amounted to, were complaints about Christianity. But here again was an objection that, if true, then I'd say Christianity would be false. And I had the option to, ignore it, which is not within my character to do, or roll up my sleeves and dig into this stuff. And that's what I did.
That's awesome. Okay. So you landed on the side that the soul exists, that we have one. So maybe we should define a few terms, and then you can kind of dig in about that. It's a huge question, but in as much as you can answer it somewhat succinctly, what is the soul? What is a soul?
Yeah. So I'd say the easiest way to look at it is when I say the word I, that word I is what we call an indexical word. It's referring to something. Like if I say here or there, it's a reference to something. When I use the word I, I'm talking about me, the self. So I would argue that the soul is just the person, the self. I am a soul. So it's not that I, quote, have a soul, but rather I am a soul and I have a body. So I have a body, but I don't have a soul. I am a soul, and a body without a soul is a corpse. And this is where I typically make my joke and say, well, actually, I do have a soul. It's an orange Kia Soul, and it's parked in my garage. And I bought that car just so I can make this joke. No kidding there. So
I'm going to count that as 2 dad jokes. I don't know why. I just feel like I need to do that. Continue.
And
he really does own that car, y'all. That's how dedicated he is.
I do. It's great. And I've used it to witness too. This guy at the gas pumps once was like, hey, nice car. I like the color. I'm thinking of getting one for my wife. How many miles does it get? I'm like, I don't know. What are the features on this? I'm like, I don't know. He's like, well, why'd you get the car? And for the next 15 minutes, I began witnessing to the guy at the gas pump. So God's used it in many ways.
That's funny. That's awesome.
So to get more technical with the definition, the soul would be an immaterial substance that is the possessor of consciousness and is the thing that grounds my identity through change and all my capacities and faculties.
So that was a lot in one sentence.
Yeah, that's the more technical metaphysical terminology to that.
When you say immaterial substance, people's minds are already exploding, right? Because immaterial substance or soul seems like a paradox, because by definition, it doesn't if something exists, it's made of matter. You're saying it's immaterial. I mean, sounds like crazy sauce. Can you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that is, first of all, the objection to me. I know it's not your objection. You're kind of playing the devil's advocate here. It's such a bizarre objection to me that sounds like crazy sauce, because first and foremost, the term substance was first used in philosophy, not in science. The term substance came from talks of Aristotle. You look at Aquinas, they begin to talk about substance, and it literally means to stand under. And this came from philosophy, and it was later that science picked it up. So when people I'll have a lot of skeptics or atheists and whatnot. They say, oh, but you're saying substance. That's a material by definition. Well, actually, no, it's not by definition. It just means something that stands under. And the reason is because we know there exist these properties such, and tell me when to stop to not get too technical, but and this will get into some of the other questions you might have. But say, for example, the property of the state of a thought, which has properties like being true or false. So here's something that is really neat. I heard J.P. Moreland say, thoughts have thinkers. So a belief, when a belief exists, it doesn't just float around in the world, but rather this state of consciousness is necessarily possessed by something. And that something would be, yes, right, absolutely, has an owner. It's possessed by something, and it is possessed by something that stands under it. Hence, you have a substance. So when I say immaterial substance, that's perfectly natural to not only the etymology of the word, but how it was first used to describe the possessor of these immaterial states and properties that we know exist. And we can get into that later, of course.
Okay, so how is a soul? Uh, you said I am a soul and I have a body. How would you maybe say a soul is different or the same as like consciousness? And maybe I'm trying to think of a way to sort of like put that either in like a story or a metaphor or something for people like to put the cookies on the bottom shelf, because that's a pretty sort of philosophical way to think about it, to say I am a soul. That still doesn't say what the soul is, you know?
Right, sure. So a few things there. Going back to the technical, and this is, of course, anytime you get into these kind of fields, there's going to be technical terminology, and that's just kind of part of the baggage, if you will, that comes with these types of fields, whether it's science or philosophy, what have you. So the soul being an immaterial substance, I think, is a very key part to understanding what the soul is, because we're going to contrast this, and we can get to the consciousness in a second. We contrast something like a substance with something with, here's another big $5 word, what we would call a mereological aggregate. We'll call it aggregate for short.
Say it again, though. What is it?
Mereological aggregate. And we can just say a purely physical object. So take something like, so aggregates are things like cars, Lego bricks, or watches. They are a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So you can assemble or disassemble Lego bricks, watches, and cars, and so forth. And then contrast that with something like a substance. So when we understand the notion of these two things, we can see how radically different they are, which will go into the arguments for how I know we have a soul. But to set the foundation, when you look at a purely physical object, like say a tricycle, its existence and identity, which are also technical terms. In philosophy, when we say identity, we don't mean similar, we mean literally the same thing as. So its existence and identity, what it is necessarily dependent on its properties and parts and its structure. So take a tricycle. If you take a wheel off a tricycle, in the metaphysical sense, we can say that literally a tricycle ceased to exist and a bicycle came into existence, which shows us that the existence of an aggregate is necessarily dependent on its properties and parts. Now, contrast that with something like a substance. Traditionally speaking, the paradigm cases for substances were living organisms. So let me go back to an aggregate really quick to just kind of unpack that a little more. If I take a tire off of a car, its existence and identity as a tire is still intact, which shows us something. It tells us that the existence and identity of a car, its existence and identity is not necessarily dependent on its connection to the car as a whole. So for aggregates, the parts are actually, the big word is ontologically prior to the parts, meaning the parts must exist before the whole can exist. Now contrast that with the substance. So I am a substance. If you were to chop off my arms and legs, I would still be a human person, which means that my arms and legs aren't necessarily dependent for my existence. I'm not dependent on my arms and legs for my existence. But Aristotle said if you chop off a human arm, it will lose its identity, which is evidenced by the fact that in a few days it would decay and cease to exist, which shows us that for substances, the inverse is true, where the properties and parts are necessarily dependent on the whole. For aggregates, the whole is necessarily dependent on the parts. And tell me if you want me to go more there, and I can touch on consciousness as well.
Go ahead and talk about consciousness, but I think the first thing that comes to my mind, and I'm playing the role of the person who understands about half of what you're saying. I mean, just for devil's advocate's sake, of course.
Of course.
But what you're talking about, I think I can follow along with and be on board with the fact that, if I lose an arm, I'm still Sarah. But I think a lot of people wouldn't say that's kind of the argument they would take. They would talk more about the mind, the brain, things like, memories and beliefs and those kinds of things. That's where the argument would be about, well, maybe we don't have a soul. Maybe we have this emergent property that comes from the mind. So, but yeah, maybe talk about consciousness, if that's the same thing as a soul, if it's something different, and then maybe we can debate about minds and bodies a little bit.
Sure. So the reason I bring up the body thing is, so whenever I either do a debate or give a case for the soul, or do a breakout session or class, weekend class on the soul, I do it by a two-step process. Sorry, my ADHD medicine is wearing off. Thank you for laughing at my mental disorder. So there's two basic points to this. The first basic point, and I say that every time people laugh, so it's funny. You can write that as a dad joke. The first is that consciousness is not physical. And the second point is I am more than a brain and body. And I would say based on these two, we can conclude I am a soul, even though they're individual arguments themselves. So really quick, just since we already brought up the body thing, in philosophy, there is the long, again, term is Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. We'll call it Leibniz's law for short. And it basically states if two things in question are the same, if they're identical, then whatever is true of one is true of the other. And that's, I mean, pretty commonsensical. If Eric Hernandez is the same person as Kendall Hernandez's husband, that's my wife, then whatever is true of Eric Hernandez is going to be true of Kendall Hernandez's husband, because we're talking about the same person. However, in principle, if I can find something true of one that's not true of the other, then they're not the same person, and my wife and I are going to have a talk, right? So this gives us a kind of a rule of thumb, a tool to know whether or not two things in question are the same. Now, when we apply this to the body, the argument is basically I am either a soul, an immaterial substance, or I am an aggregate, a purely physical object. So if I am not identical to my brain and body, or reducible to my brain and body, then I must be something more than a brain and body. And I use three different arguments. There's a lot more to use, but one we've already touched on is, let's say, identity through change. Because like you said, yes, people are typically going to go to consciousness, but maybe that's the more popular or whatever, but the implications of saying there is no soul lead to absurd things such as this. If I am a purely physical object, then I do not maintain what's called identity through change, meaning I am the same person from one moment to the next. Like you said, if, God forbid you lost your arms and legs, you're still Sarah. You're still the same person. If you lose an arm, a Sarah doesn't cease to exist, and a new Sarah lookalike doesn't come into existence. Now, Jaegwon Kim, who's an atheist philosopher, he's used this argument in a book to talk about the soul, and he gives this argument in this way. He says, this brain and body did not exist in 2011, but I did exist in 2011. Therefore, I am not identical or reducible to my brain and body. Therefore, I must be something more like a soul. Now, he just kind of gives that as reflection, not necessarily endorsing that, but that's the argument in a nutshell. There's a lot more examples like that, but if I maintain identity change, if I have even something like free will, if being a human is what's called a non-degreed property, men are typically larger than women. And if we're going to base being a person on something physical, then it's quantifiable in terms of matter. But the question is, does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? Well, no, of course not. So given that we're not reducible to matter, then you can't place value on someone bigger or shorter in terms of being person, because personhood is a non-degreed property. However, if my body can come in percentages and degrees, but I'm an all or nothing kind of thing, then it follows I am not identical or reducible to a brain and body. And it follows, therefore, my existence and identity must be granted as something transcendent to the body, namely the soul. Now, am I still there? It looked like I froze.
Your picture froze, but your voice is still with us, and you look very contemplative. It's good. You didn't, freeze in an awkward position.
Yeah, I have no. Okay, so I'll just keep going.
Just keep going. Hopefully, it'll pop back in, and
okay.
It's just your soul talking now, Eric.
There
the
you
body
go.
has left us, but you're still you. Thank goodness.
So consciousness, really quick. Consciousness is a. Give me 1 second. This is
go ahead and fiddle with it if you want. I already feel like I have a water hose of information that's come at me. Whew. Sure. I wonder if this is how non-Christians feel when I start talking about Jesus.
I don't know.
Okay,
I think Jesus is easier to understand. It looks good. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, and I'm trying to think, because as you can tell, every time there's a question, it jumps into a whole bunch of other more questions and topics and areas.
Well, I can also tell that you talk about it a lot, and so you've got the answer ready. But for those of us that are sort of new to it, it's a lot to take in at once. But continue.
Yeah, and I apologize too because I know we're trying to keep it within the hour, and I naturally talk fast.
Sort
Have an
of. No, you're
ADHD,
good.
so
You're good.
okay. Um, so I am a soul, and you can think of a soul like what JP Moreland says, a chest of drawers. You have a sock drawer, an underwear drawer, a pants drawer, shorts drawer, and my soul is what grounds my capacities and my faculties. So my mind is a faculty of my soul. To try and maybe simplify it to kind of help the listener grasp the concept. So it's when you ask, what's the relation or difference between my consciousness or my mind and my soul, is like asking, what's the difference between my hands and my body? Well, my hands are a part of my body. They're not a separate aspect of my body, but they are a part of my body as a whole. My mind is a faculty of my soul, and it is the way in which I have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will. It's kind of like if I say, what part of your body sees? Well, not your hands or your tongue, it's your eyes. So what part of your body smells? Well, it's not your ears or your fingertips, it's your nose. In the same line of reasoning, it's my mind which contains my conscious states and properties, and there's 5 states of consciousness: thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, and that is a faculty of my soul.
So when you start talking about senses, again, taking a little bit of a skeptical view here, I think, sure, the nose takes in what you need to smell, but it's the brain that's doing the heavy lifting. And in the same way, you could say that all the senses are coming back to the brain. And I think a lot of people that are skeptical about the existence of a soul would say, well, you're saying these things, like you said, my mind is a faculty of my soul, but how do you know? I listened to an interview that you did once where you said, you can be more certain about your consciousness and soul than you can about your body. We've lost him again. He's been taken up.
No, I'm still here.
He's really trying to make a statement about the soul body distinction here. Where did you go, Eric?
Sorry, I had to move something. Yeah, you're saying I'm more certain.
Yeah, it just seems like being able to say the phrase, my mind is a faculty of my soul, or that you can be more certain about your consciousness and your soul than you can about your body. It seems like an outrageous claim. So I'm curious how you feel like how can anybody know that we have a soul?
Yeah, very good. So given that consciousness is a faculty of my soul, if I'm conscious, I would argue that you necessarily have to have a soul to ground these immaterial states and properties. So now let's go into the consciousness, because remember my 2 basic point approach is consciousness is not physical. I am more than a brain and body. So we started with the body first. Let's go to the consciousness. Going back to Leibniz's law of identity, which is fundamental to understanding these arguments, is again, if 2 things in question are not the same, have different properties, and they cannot be the same thing. Mm-hmm. So if there is no soul and consciousness is simply something physical, then whatever is true of my conscious states and properties are necessarily going to be true of my brain states and properties, because it's like saying water and H2O. I'm just using 2 different words to refer to the same thing, but we know that's not true. So take a state of my mind, my thoughts, and take a state of my brain. Let's say a neurons firing, brain state X. Now, my thoughts can be true or false, but no state or brain firing is true or false. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you doesn't weigh 3 pounds. While we may be having heavy, I was gonna say, while we may be having heavy thoughts in this conversation, we're not gonna go by neck braces after this discussion's over. So you can check another one there.
I got you.
My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or taste of banana is not 7 inches long. There's a dozen more examples we can go into, but the point is simply that if all the states and properties of my mind are these genuinely new mental states and properties that are not physical, and if all the states and properties of my brain are physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it can't be reducible or identical to something physical like the brain. Now, note, however, there is a difference between the relationship of identity, A is A, versus a correlation or dependence relationship or cause and effect relationship. So yes, when you, if I have Alzheimer's or you hit me over the head, yes, that affects my mental states. And people will say, that proves that there is no soul, or that you're just talking about your brain. No, it doesn't. That doesn't establish identity. That merely establishes a correlation of cause and effect or dependence. But like, again, atheist philosopher Jaegwon Kim said, correlations are not explanations. They're the very thing that need explaining. So there's a bunch of different illustrations or analogies to use. I usually refer to something like a guitar. If I'm the world's greatest guitar player, which I'm not, I don't even play guitar, and I have great talent, I use the guitar as an instrument to convey my talent. But if you pop a guitar string, I may not be able to play the music. But no one's going to say, therefore, it follows I am a guitar, just because there's a correlation, or that my talent is in the guitar, or even that the music is inside the guitar, even though affecting the instrument will affect the way the music sounds. I don't break up when a guitar and the note C falls out, and you don't cut open a brain and see my thoughts or beliefs. A neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he cannot know more about my mental life than I do, because consciousness is not a physical thing. It's something that has what's called first person, private, or privileged access. If you want to know about my brain, any third party can do that. If you want to know about my thoughts, you have to ask me, because thoughts aren't physical and they're not extended. If they were physical, then you just open up my brain and see them, but you don't.
So let me jump in with a couple of questions. So and maybe you've already answered this, but it went over my head. Where is the soul? And you can give as short an answer as you want to that.
Yeah, so I would say it's a category fallacy to ask a question like that. It's kind of like saying, where's the number 2? How many number 2s can you fit in your pocket, and how heavy will your pants be? It's the soul. If immaterial, then it's not extended in space, and it has no weight or anything like that. Now, I know that's, go ahead. Sure.
Well, but isn't my soul like usually hanging around my body? Like how far, I mean, now, and also I do want to ask seriously a question about like near-death experiences, because I'm curious if that research plays a role in this. I mean, I know Gary Habermas uses it a lot with kind of resurrection and evidences and things like that. But yeah, like how, I mean, okay, let me take another step back. As another kind of, I think that there are two people who would disagree with you mostly. One are, of course, are like pure physicalists, right? People who believe that there is no soul, but other people who would not agree with your first phrase that I am a soul, I have a body. And this gets in, I think, ultimately into like resurrection questions, like new earth, new heavens, like resurrection of the body questions. Like, well, if we only have a body, but we're not a body, then what's resurrected? But before I get that, that's why I wanted to ask about like, where is the soul? Because it seems to like hang around. It's like my shadow, it's like wherever I am, it seems to be too. But then again, I said I, so of course the soul is always with me if that's what I am. So let me put it this way. Where my soul usually is, it seems like my body is in close proximity. Coincidence? Is that a dumb question? You can tell me if it is. He's
going to tell you it's another category error.
Okay. In a sense, it is, because even note, and these are good questions. Note, even the notion of hanging around my body is still a something that's located within space, right? So I would say that your soul is causally active within your body, and where those lines are drawn is more of a posteriori notion we come to, not something a priori. I mean, it's something we come to after the fact. One way to think of it, and without getting into heresy, it's just an illustration for the sake
we
of
like to stay away from heresy here on Theology on Air. Yeah.
We can say
get that as close as you can without yeah.
That my soul is omnipresent to my body, much like God would be omnipresent to the universe. It's not a pantheism where God is in it per se, but he's causally active at every point in space. In a similar vein, and of course I'm talking to the Christians here, my soul is omnipresent to my body in that causal type of active power sense. It has the ability to act in my body because it's omnipresent to my body, much like God could act at any point in space, though he's not physically located in space himself.
So then what's the distinction between, just to really dumb it down here, if I have a thought that comes to me, and it's a pretty good, contemplative thought, I think, oh, that's good, and I stew on it for a while, is that my soul doing that? Is that my brain doing that? Or is that another category fallacy?
So you're asking, when you have a thought, who's or what's doing that? Is that the question?
Like, would I say that that's my soul that's produced that thought? Is that my brain that has just taken all the information that I've been fed up to this point and is percolating and sort of computing it and coming up with a conclusion?
Yeah, so we definitely, so so I'm a substance dualist, and
We're gonna get into that. Yeah.
Moreland calls this a Thomistic like dualism. He calls himself a peeping Thomist, and that's his joke, so don't count
That's
it
cute.
as mine. But it's
But you said it, so it's a half a point.
well, yeah. But so there's a deep integration between the body and soul, and he would say that the body is infused with the soul, kind of like sugar and water. You mix it, and so to kind of put perspective to the question, to me, that's like asking, what taste do you taste, or does your tongue taste? Well, I taste by way of my tongue. So when you're thinking, those are your states and properties, which is a faculty of your mind, but that is possessed by you. You are the thinker. So hopefully that putting it in that perspective kind of helps. Same thing with spirit. The spirit is a faculty of my soul. It's not something, a separate substance, but it's the faculty through which I communicate with God. My mind is a faculty through which I have these 5 conscious states and properties, and so on and so forth. So yes, you are thinking, and it's the faculty of your mind, much like when you're tasting, but you're using your tongue to taste.
Okay, so you just made a distinction between souls and spirits, which is one of the questions I had like 10 down my list. Because people do use those terms interchangeably, right? Oh, I have a soulmate. My spirit is drawn to him. My spirit talks to the Lord. But then we talk about having the Holy Spirit in us, and that's different. So maybe talk us through that a little bit. Souls and spirits, what's the difference?
Yeah, so I would just kind of reiterate what I said, that it's a faculty of your soul, and so so there, and it's pretty popular and I don't, hopefully this doesn't sound derogatory, condescending, in a lay crowd who maybe people who haven't studied this typically tend to take what's called a trichotomist position, and they say no, you're a body, soul, spirit. And they're saying like there's 3 substances. And I say, well, I would say, no, the spirit is just a faculty of the soul. It's dualism, literally twoism. And I would just say that the spirit is a faculty of the soul. And you might say, oh, but the body talks about the spirit. It sure does. But it also talks about the heart. It also talks about the mind.
Did you mean to say the Bible talks about? You said the body talks about.
Yes, I meant to say Bible if I said body.
Sorry.
Yes.
I'm just making sure that I'm like picking up what you're laying down because it's a lot. Continue.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, it's like saying, how many hands do you have? 2. Oh, and you have 1 body, 2 hands. Well, that's 3. No, I have 1 body that has 2 hands. So when we look at what we are, yes, I am a soul. Yes, I have a faculty of spirit, and yes, I have a body, but these aren't 3 separate substances. There's only 1 captain of the ship, and whoever the captain is, that's you. So I'm going to say my soul, which means the other things are aspects or faculties of my soul, much like my spirit and my mind and so forth.
Man, oh man. Okay, to go back to something Evan was asking, he asked about sort of where is the soul located, and we talked about that. That's maybe it's not a geographical kind of thing, but it's, if we are a soul and we have a body, then before there was a body, before there was an Eric Hernandez body, was your soul floating around in quote heaven? And then, the corollary there is what's going to happen after your body dies.
So I take what's called a traducian view of the soul. And again, these questions can get pretty deep really quick. So there are 2 views of the origin of the soul. One is a creationist view, and the other is a traducianist view. And I'm going to oversimplify them just for the sake of time.
We always want you to oversimplify.
The creationist view, God looks down and he sees a sperm and egg meet, and he's like, yeah, looks about right. Looks like the right physical conditions are met. Hey, Gabriel, zap that bad boy with the soul. So you have God continually creating souls when the right physical conditions are met. I hold to a traducian view of the soul. And again, this is oversimplified. And it basically is a notion that I get my soul in some sense because of who my parents are. And this is a type of substantial change. Now, why go there? There's biblical reasons and philosophical reasons. There's, I would say, a posteriori reasons. Let me give one of those first. So when you cut a starfish arm off, it has the ability to grow into a new starfish. Now, I think anything that's conscious and that's a first mover in that type of sense is going to have a soul. So I would say starfish have souls.
Whoa. Let me stop you right there. Are you saying a starfish has a soul?
I am. You have starfish souls. So
okay,
yeah,
continue.
yeah, no, there's cans of
Woo!
worms everywhere.
I know.
But
There's also starfish everywhere.
there you go. Yeah.
Because
Apparently.
arms get chopped off and
Yeah.
sorry.
And that's because biological matter is infused with soulish totipotentiality that has the ability to have some type of a substantial change when certain physical conditions are met. So Moreland would argue something like when you get hydrogen and oxygen and you put them together, the reason there's new properties is because a new substance comes into existence. So he would say technically hydrogen and oxygen in some sense cease to exist and a new substance comes to be, namely water, but we call it H2O because we're reductionistic and whatnot. In a similar way, when a sperm and egg meet, which have soulish totipotentiality, a new substance comes to be, namely me. So a biblical reason too is because scripture, and I'm just scratching the surface. Scripture teaches, let everything reproduce after its kind. And from the onset, Moreland says that Genesis is in some sense an apologetic against the pagans because, they said, if you want your crops to grow, you do these, sexual rituals. And they said, no, God set it up from the beginning that everything is going to reproduce after its kind, meaning it already has within itself what it needs to reproduce. And that would include not just the physical, but the metaphysical. And so that being said, the soul is what drives the formation of my body, and the soul is ontologically prior to my body. So on my view, the existence of a body presupposes the existence of a soul because you're not going to have a soul without a body. It's actually the soul that drives the information of DNA to create my body. And the reason I have eyes is because my soul has the capacity for sight and needs a body to be able to utilize these faculties and capacities and creates a body with eyes. If you take my eyes out, yes, I go blind, but if you can replace them, I could still see because it wasn't my eyes that sees, it was my soul that sees, that uses my eyes as an instrument while embodied.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand that as well as I can. So if it wasn't your mom and dad, but your mom and the milkman, okay, Eric Hernandez would be a different person because God's not up there zapping souls into just any tube, sperm and egg, but like actually it's your parents who in a way imparted not their souls into you, but explain that one more time.
There was, so there was, and again, this is, it's quite technical here, of course. That these, hypothetically, if you could chop off my finger, hypothetically, you could make some type of a clone from that. And again, these are things we discover a posteriori, after investigation, after the fact, in some sense, empirical investigation, that the biological tissue, living tissue, has this soulish totipotentiality because, again, think of sugar and water being mixed together. Now, note you said, so here's kind of a bit of a tangent, but still very much related. So if my mother, had not met my father and she was with someone else, it's not that Eric Hernandez would be a different person. It's that I literally would not exist. Gotcha. Now, what makes this interesting is that, and I hate to take away some sermon points, though it could still be used in some ways, but, I don't know if you're like me, but you read on Facebook when people post these Christianese quotes and you're like, not really. There's one where people say, oh, God made you in this time for a reason. That's why he didn't make you, during the time of Noah. That's why he didn't make you at a different time. Why, in my view, he couldn't have, because you are necessarily a byproduct of your parents. And literally, metaphysically speaking, God could not have created me at a different point of time if the way in which I came into existence is in part because of my parents. Now that gets into that lends to Molinism. So I won't mention the name, but there's a very prominent speaker who's a friend of mine. If I named him, you would know him, who's also a Calvinist, but rejects Molinism.
Okay, you are using a lot of words that people don't know now. So, and I don't want to get into this debate, but just very briefly, do you want to say it, or do you want me to say kind of what those terms mean? Go ahead and just quickly say what the term means. Otherwise, whatever you say next, people are gonna be like, what?
Gotcha. Okay. So Molinism is the view that God has what we call mental knowledge. He knows what would have happened had a different set of circumstance occurred. So if I would have had one more sister, God knows what my life would have played out differently. Now we can see this in movies. There's a whole bunch of movies like that, butterfly effect kind of thing. You change one thing, something else changes. God knows what would have happened had other circumstances occurred. On Calvinism it's you can Google that and find all kinds of stuff, but on Calvinism, what's related to this is on this view, God elects who is saved and who's not saved. He chooses that. And I'm trying to leave out the loaded language, if you will, but we'll just leave it at that. Mm-hmm. Now, this prominent friend of mine who's a Calvinist but rejects Molinism, I said, well, hold on, you hold to a traducian view of the soul. Yes. Okay, but if that's the case, you wouldn't necessarily have to affirm Molinism, and here's why. In order for God to elect who's saved, he also has to elect who exists. And if the traducian view of the soul is the way in which God creates people and brings them into existence, then he would necessarily have to have counterfactual knowledge of who he needs to meet with who in order to have what babies in order for these people to exist that he has already elected. So if Calvinism is true and the traducian view of the soul is true, then necessarily I would say Molinism would have to be true as well.
And this is why I cannot drink the wine in front of you. Whew. Okay. So that's my mom joke. That's from The Princess Bride, y'all. That's for free. We have a question from Facebook that I want to ask. But the question starts with a term that I want to make sure we kind of understand and have correct first. He's asking about if substance dualism is correct. So before we go on, let me see if I have this right. Substance dualism is this idea that human beings have both a physical body and an immaterial soul. Is that right? Did I freeze? I did freeze.
Well, I can hear you.
So you heard my question?
Yes, but go ahead and repeat that for me.
Okay, so my understanding of the term substance dualism is this idea that human beings have both a physical body and an immaterial soul. Is that a fair reductionist view? Okay, and then the sort of opposite of that, maybe not the opposite, but another a common viewpoint maybe would be, especially like in Christianity, this physicalism, the idea that human beings are merely physical, beings with an immaterial, with no immaterial substance like a soul. Is that correct? And they would probably say that what we call a soul is some kind of emergent property of the mind. Is that?
Yeah. So really quick there. Yeah. So dualism is a very generic term, and I hold to substance dualism, but that would include what's also called property dualism. Okay. A property dualist says there is a duality of properties, physical and immaterial. So a lot of philosophers would agree that conscious states and properties are not physical, including agnostic, non-believing, non-Christian, atheist philosophers. Thomas Nagel comes to mind, men like that. Even I would even say John Searle, although he defines things differently. But what they would say is, okay, yeah, you're physical, but somehow your brain produces these immaterial, what's called sui generis, new weird kind of properties that we can't put our finger on. Mm-hmm. Now that's a property dualist. There's two properties, but just one possessor, and it's a physical thing, and you're a physical thing. Substance dualism goes further and says not only are there immaterial states and properties as well as physical states and properties, but there is an immaterial substance that possesses these conscious states and properties. So if someone is going to, even if someone's going to say, okay, yeah, but we could say that, the brain produces these conscious states and properties, well, you're still a type of dualist. You're just maybe not a substance dualist.
Okay. Interesting. Well, so maybe I was trying to simplify it too much, but let me ask this question from one of our viewers on Facebook, and you can take it away. It says, if substance dualism is correct, and you can't say the soul is spatially located, so the soul doesn't actually reside in the body, then if someone dies and their soul goes to heaven, how can we say that they are, quote, in heaven, since the soul can't be spatially located, being immaterial? I'm hoping you can still hear me, even if your video went away.
Yes. Sorry, I think my phone's dying, which is weird. Oh, it's not plugged in. I have it plugged in the charger, but not in the. Wow. Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm sorry.
This is a sermon illustration. If you don't have it in the power source, it doesn't matter how amazing it is. Anyway. Okay, since you seem to be able to hear me, I'm just going to ask the question one more time because sometimes I need to hear it twice, and maybe some of our listeners do too. It says, if substance dualism is correct, and you can't say the soul is spatially located, so the soul doesn't actually reside in the body, then if someone dies and their soul goes to heaven, how can we say that they are, quote, in heaven, since the soul can't be spatially located, being immaterial? Some of our listeners are smarter than I am. This is good.
So again, the whole goes to heaven thing, we're still using extended physical language. And yeah, it is a bit difficult to kind of wrap your mind around if you haven't kind of thought of these things in these ways. But it's so, for example, the Bible talks about God having a throne, right? But does God have a butt? Does he have legs? Does he need to sit? No, of course not, right? So do with that what you will, because I don't want to go into another tangent. But even when we say God's in heaven, we know that God's immaterial, but yet we're not going to think of it as some type of a physical location. At least we shouldn't. One time I was in a youth group, and there was this young lady, and she's like, "Why do we bow our heads when we pray? We should be looking up to God." And I guess I hadn't said enough prayers that day, and I was like, "Well, actually," and I kind of felt like I crushed her soul, if you will. And I said, "Well, it depends. If people in China and us here, we're on different parts of the globe, so." Which up is up, or is it east and west? So if we're looking down, maybe actually we are looking up, because the people in China, that's up. And anyways, so yeah, I think when we're using these physical languages, it limits our train of thought when it comes to these kind of things. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answered the question or not, or I don't know if you want to push back.
I'm trying to imagine what it's like to be your wife and get in a fight with you. This is just like, well, that comes down to the principle. No, I'm kidding.
So I made a mistake when I first got married, and I did that at first. I learned really quick not to. I need to get a trophy for this. I'm self-proclaimed the only person to have stumped Dr. William Lane Craig. One time it was at a Texas Baptist conference, and during Q&A, I asked him two questions. One was philosophical, and I appreciated his answer. And then I said, now here's a tougher, harder question. I said, being an expert in philosophy and knowing how to argue and knowing how to point out logical fallacies, I said, what's the best way to argue with your spouse without kind of giving into that? And I said, and I'm asking for a friend, not for me. That was the only time I saw him laugh and not answer the question. So
that's cute. I love it.
But we did talk later, and he gave me some great advice. But yeah,
he's not going to give away all his trade secrets.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Let's go back to a couple of these sort of like maybe someone might call it like a kindergarten level question. You said something about starfish, and I have always understood that the sort of traditional Christian theology said that humans had souls, but that animals and plants and things didn't. So how are you coming to the conclusion that animals do, and do you think plants do also?
Yeah, so people who say that, I say poppycock. I would ask them how they came to that conclusion. But so I see these aren't kindergarten questions. They're still great questions. So without getting into the technical details, because there's always room to disagree, and I have answers to the objections, but just at a surface level, if you look at the Hebrew, when it says God created, these land animals, it says he created the nephesh creatures, which literally means soul creatures. So even in the Hebrew, that word is used as soul. And I know people can interpret that different. I have a debate with Chris Date coming up in November, and I know he would disagree with this, with the way I'm using it here, but it does talk about animals as soul creatures. Moreover, from a philosophical side, going back to consciousness, given that you have these immaterial states and properties that need to be possessed, that I would say by an immaterial substance, anything that's conscious is going to have a soul. So you can use like almost like a two-part step with identifying whether or not something has a soul. The easiest way is if it's conscious, I would say automatically free pass, this bad boy has a soul. If it's a substance that is ontologically prior to its parts and is a type of first mover, I would say we have reason to believe that there might be a soul there, and maybe we can look for other features. Do plants have a soul? Aristotle would say so, but he would also define things a little bit differently. But if by soul you mean a life principle, which is, I believe, a type of phrase he used, then you could say, yes, they do. Some people would argue they do, they don't. I'm okay with leaving that in a gray area and saying, even if I don't know where I draw the line, I can say for sure on this end of the spectrum, yes. A rock, no. As we get closer to the middle, it may be a little fuzzy, but I think we've got enough parameters to keep looking here and into these kind of questions.
So if you're talking about an animal being conscious, I don't know exactly how we're deducing if an animal is conscious, because I would think that consciousness would sort of be its own, like you have self-awareness of your own consciousness. We can't look at a slug and I'm just wondering how far down we go, like bacteria, amoebas, like are they conscious? Are they self-aware of themselves? You might say, yeah, it's easy to say like a dog or a cat or an elephant, but when you get down into some of those other animals, it's really hard for me to wrap my mind around. Maybe I'm just being a brat, but
no. It's a fair point, and I'm fine with in these instances saying I don't know. Maybe there might be some more a posteriori investigation we could do into this, but again, with those parameters, I think it's like asking how many chicken nuggets should I eat to get full? Well, I can X out 1,000 and I can X out 1, and I can just kind of keep going and see where I find myself. Nevertheless, now regarding consciousness, now I would also say there are different levels and hierarchies of consciousness. Let me go back to the traducian view of the soul, where it is the soul that forms my body. I think there are some empirical a posteriori things we can look at, given the notion of the soul, that I think would help aid us in our understanding of these things. And here's what I mean by that. So first and foremost, a thought, belief, sensation, desire, act of will, 5 states of consciousness. If my dog has any of those 5, he's conscious. And I think we do find that our dogs have thoughts and beliefs. They have sensations. They have desires. So that's consciousness. Now, to I guess just kind of cut it really quick down the middle to make a divide. So I can have thoughts. My dog can have thoughts. But I can have thoughts about my thoughts and beliefs about my beliefs, whereas my dog only has thoughts but doesn't have thoughts about his thoughts.
How do you know?
My dog, well, great question too, because we don't find evidence that we would expect to see. So for example, and this goes into another interesting question of consciousness not being physical. Okay, let's say we both look at, we both look at this, and I say red, this is red, and you say, I agree. But how do I know that you're seeing red and not what I call blue? Well, I don't know. I just assume you do, because for all I know, maybe you do see blue, but you've been told to call this red.
I've named it red. Correct. Yeah.
I had a friend. Well, he's still alive. I just don't talk to him anymore. That sounded weird. Who was colorblind, and he couldn't see red or green. Red and green appeared as yellow. And the way I found out was because we're looking at this poster of Skittles. It was one of those inspirational posters. And I'm like, oh, look, the red Skittles say hope, and like the green Skittles say love or something like that. And he's like, I don't see anything. I'm like, they're right there. I'm like, what, are you blind? And he's like, well, kind of. and so now this blows my mind, because you think of like, blood, grass. I mean, it's like a Dr. Seuss world. He sees a shade of yellow. Now I say that to say, the only reason I assume that you have mental states like I do is because, like, if I get stabbed with a needle, a syringe, I say, ouch. And when I see that happen to you, you say, ouch. So I attribute the same mental states, the same quality that I experience to you. I think the same is analogous and applies to animals. As analogous as animals are to me, I can attribute that level of consciousness. Now, to what degree of accuracy? I don't know, but I think it's sufficient to be able to at least lay out some parameters and say, yeah, it seems like my dog has thoughts and beliefs, but I don't see my dog, reading Descartes or anything like that, or trying to reflect on his moral attributes or having beliefs about his beliefs. The problem with people these days overall, and I would even say especially in the church, it's not that we lack thinking. It's that we lack thinking about our thinking. And it's that higher order level of consciousness and capacities that really make us distinct from these lower level conscious creatures.
Did you just call some Christian dogs? I think that's what just happened. I'm kidding.
No, that was
Evan,
Jesus
did you have
said, I can't give the bread to the dog. So
yeah, well, that's true. Did you have a question, Evan? Because I have like 4,000 left.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay.
So I'm curious when we say that people are made in God's image, right? Well, the Bible says they're made in God's image. Does the soul have anything to do with that, or would you say that's a different category?
Yeah, great question. So this is something I haven't looked too deeply into myself, but there are different views of what it means to be the Imago Dei, the image of God. I think it is something ontological about us. Some people would say, well, it's...
Can you define what that word means? Because you've used it several times, and I mean, I know what it means, but I don't know that everybody does. Ontological.
Yes. So ontology deals with things like the grounding for. So my thoughts would not exist if I didn't exist. So
Okay.
I am the ontological basis for which Eric Hernandez's thoughts exist. If I didn't exist, my thoughts would exist. So ontologically speaking, I am what grounds my thoughts.
Okay. Sorry,
now,
go ahead.
No, that's a good question. And I forgot what I was. What was I?
Imago
answering?
Dei.
Yes. Okay. Now, there's different ways to look at it. And some people say, well, it's a functional role that we engage in. Like I am a father, and that's a functional role that I fulfill. I don't think the Imago Dei is something that can be reduced to a functional role, because even the very notion of reducing it to a function presupposes that the ability to carry out that function is grounded within my nature, my soul. So in order for me to be able to fulfill the function, it has to first be something ontologically within me. Let me explain that in different ways. If I plant an acorn in the ground, it has the ability to grow into a tree. But I can't plant my 3-year-old son in the ground and he's not going to grow into a tree, because it's not within his nature to have that capacity to fulfill that function, because he lacks that faculty. So I think the Imago Dei is something that is intrinsic, that is ontological. And I do think the soul, I definitely, something tells me that, yes, the soul has something to do with being made in the image of God. And I think that goes anything from being an immaterial substance, from having a libertarian free will, from having a higher order type of rationality, being able to reproduce and different things like that. And yes, those are functions, but functions are necessarily grounded in the ontology of a thing's nature.
So do you think there's any kind of danger in a separate question now, any kind of danger in sort of separating the soul from the body? So for example, if someone commits a crime where they harm your body, have they harmed you, or have they just done something to your body? What have they done really wrong? What kind of price should they pay for that? I mean, some people would take it to say the logical extension of this would that we would have such a low view of humanity, because we're separating souls from bodies, that we could essentially put bodies into slavery. We could put bodies, that we can punish bodies, and there's really no spiritual consequence for that, because they're just bodies. There's nothing special or sacred in any way about it. Do you think there's any kind of danger in separating those things, or maybe if that's just the way it is, that the danger is a moot point?
Yeah, I think there's something about what's the word I'm looking for? Without separating them in an irrational, unjustified way. So given the fact that although I am not reducible to a brain and body, while I am embodied, I still act within reality through my brain and body, which if you pinch me, it's going to hurt, but my brain is not hurting. I am hurting. It's like when I'm hungry, my neurons aren't hungry. I'm hungry. So you're still doing something to me. You're just doing it via an intermediate mechanism. So yeah, I think doing something to my body, we could say, is doing something to me. And we don't even have to go to something physical here. If you say some really nasty words towards me, I'm having ADHD, especially with these conversations. I tend to separate the emotion and logic, but let's say, okay, like my wife can offend me, but it's really hard for someone I don't know to offend me. Mm-hmm. So she can use words to hurt me, though it's not a physical hurt, it's still affecting me. So what is she affecting? Well, she's not affecting my body. Yes, her neurons firing. And again, I go back to the correlation of mind and brain, which actually I'd like to touch on something after this. But she's still doing something that is affecting me How she's affecting me is a different question, be it physical, emotional, psychological, whatever the case is. It's still something that is affecting me, the person, the self, the conscious subject.
Okay, last question, and this is a more or
From
less
Evan, because I still have a
Yeah.
couple.
okay. This is more or less a yes or no. If the answer is yes, we'll do a whole other podcast on it. If it's no, then we'll just move on. Can you prove the existence of the soul?
Yes. It depends what you mean by proof, but yes.
Okay, so schedule that one, Sarah.
Okay, we got it. Proving the existence of the soul. We'll slate out an hour for that. It should be fine. A couple final questions from me, and then you said there was something else you wanted to touch on, Eric. I know you could talk about this for days, but can souls be destroyed?
Good question. So in principle, yes. Now, if you're going to ask, can a human soul be destroyed? I would say no, not because it's as if God lacks the power to do so, but this is more of a moral argument that I got from Moreland, which goes against an annihilationist view.
Yeah, well, that was where I was going to go next. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think souls, just because souls are immaterial, they automatically get a free pass to being eternal. I don't think just because you're an immaterial substance, automatically you're going to be eternal. I think this is something that God chooses to grant to certain kinds or types of souls. So that being said, Moreland would say something like, an animal, though they have a soul, they don't necessarily get free access granted to heaven just because they have souls. That's something God's still going to have to decide. Now, one of the reasons I would reject an annihilationist view, and I am by no means an expert, and I haven't studied as much as I'd like to or could on this topic, but I think this is a fair argument from Moreland in that, given that we're made in God's image, the long story short of the argument is that it would be immoral for God to destroy something that bears his image. And thus we human persons are eternal, not merely because we're immaterial souls, immaterial substances, but because God has granted us with that Imago Dei that he is not going to destroy, because that would be a moral violation on his part.
Oh, that's good. I like that. All right. My last question. I mean, I could go on for a while. I have several that I have not crossed out on my little list, but why does it matter? Like, and I'm using the word matter, not the way that we've been talking about matter. Why does it matter if we have a soul? Who has souls? How they operate? What's the sort of end game here? Like, if someone says, well, I don't believe in souls. So like, to what end are we even having this conversation?
Yeah, so maybe we can get into this in the other scheduled thing we're going to do on the quote proving the soul, and where I can get into the arguments and lay them out better on the soul. You can go to my YouTube channel, shameless plug, YouTube / Eric Hernandez. Excuse me. So I think the aside from, I would say the Bible teaches it and presupposes something like substance dualism, I would even say that the intellectual price tags you're going to have to pay to denying the soul are just so incredible that I think this is one of the reasons I mentioned, I think I am more certain that I have a soul than I have a body. When I wake up, let's say I wake up in the middle of the night, for all I know, I could be waking up in a bathtub full of ice, and there are some pieces of my body missing. Mm-hmm. So I can wake up thinking my entire body's there, and yet come to find it's not. But when I wake up, I immediately know which thoughts are mine. And it's not like I can confuse that. So I can be mistaken about which body parts are mine, but I can never be mistaken about which thoughts or mental states are mine.
Or so you think.
Well, I would say a property of consciousness is that it's incorrigible, meaning you can never be wrong about it. When you go to an eye doctor and they say, cover the eye, what do you see? And you say, I see an 8. He's not like, this guy's an idiot, it's a 3. He assumes that you know your mental states enough to convey what you see, even if what you see is not a reflection of reality.
Yeah.
So even when I dream that I'm falling, if I'm in class and then I fell asleep and then I wake up, was I falling? No. But did I have an experience of falling? Yes. So my mental states are incorrigible.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, what was the question?
It was saying, why does it matter?
Oh, why does it matter? Right. The intellectual price tag. So let's so this is actually touches on something I wanted to touch on. So if there is no soul, there is no free will. And I think free will is important for a vast amount of reasons, but here's something to consider. So people with like OCD, anxiety, depression, what they have is they have a chemical imbalance that is causally determined by their brain and body chemistry that is induced on them. People who have anxiety and depression don't will to be depressed. They don't will to have anxiety. It's something imposed on them by their brain and body. It's like when I wake up from a nightmare. I had a nightmare, a really weird nightmare a long time ago when I was like a teenager, of Lamb Chop coming to my door, you know, that little puppet. I don't know why it freaked me out. But anyways, I remember waking up, and I've never been afraid of Lamb Chop. Like it was a weird dream, but I woke up and I still had this feeling of fear in me, even though I knew I was home. I knew I was safe. I knew Lamb Chop's not real. And it you know, as an amateur philosopher, if you will, you know, in those kind of moments, it's fun to step back and just analyze and observe yourself. And I noticed I still had these feelings of fear, even though I knew everything was okay. And it was the chemicals passing through my body. Once they passed, I was good. People with anxiety and depression and OCD have these chemicals induced on them beyond their control. However, Jeffrey Schwartz, who's one of the leading neuroscientists, I think he teaches at UC Berkeley, who was not a believer, is now a believer and believes in the soul. Which is funny because people say you believe in a soul because you don't understand the neuroscience. Now I can give you some Nobel Prize neuroscientists and some of the world's leading neuroscientists who believe in the soul. That's another topic. But he utilizes what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. And what we know about what's called neuroplasticity, and here's what I'm getting at. Jeffrey Schwartz did this study, and he has a book I think called "You Are Not Your Brain," where he gives a 4-step process. And basically, someone with anxiety is going to have these feelings of anxiousness that is imposed on them by their brain, which creates a habitual way of thinking. So this is something that is physically induced. You could put things on my head and brain and make me think or feel things. What Jeffrey Schwartz, and I'm just giving a brief version here, he teaches his patients to learn to think and go against the habitual thoughts that are induced and feelings that are induced by your brain. So he takes a brain scan of these people and looks at the chemical composition of their brain. He has them go through this cognitive behavioral therapy process. And I forget if it was a month or a few months, or I don't know how much long later. After having them go through these and exercising this daily, he takes another brain scan and sees that they have, in a sense, rewired the chemistry of their brain by thinking differently and going against the causal biological inputs of their brain. Why is this important? And neuroplasticity shows us that, yes, we can stretch and almost rewire our neurons. Well, because this would necessitate that you are more than a brain and body in order to go against the habitual ways of thinking that your brain and body induces upon you. Now, why is this also important? Let's look at spiritual formation and discipleship. The reason we fast is not just to starve ourselves and hope that God's going to answer our prayers, but it's literally a way of submitting the flesh and saying, look, body, I know you want to eat, but guess what? You're not in charge. I'm in charge. I tell you when to eat. You don't tell me when to eat. And thus we're feeding our spiritual man and not feeding the flesh. And this is why you find Paul in Romans 7 saying, what I want to do, I don't end up doing, and the good and the bad I don't want to do, I end up doing. The good I want to do, I don't do. But then he says, but I've learned that there is nothing within me that is my flesh that is good. So there's a warring between the spirit and the body. And the spirit and soul is used interchangeably. It's another topic. They're not interchangeable, but it's like saying the heart of a man. Well, he's not just talking of only the heart. It's a part of the whole relation. So you find that something like a soul is necessary for something like libertarian free will, which I would argue is necessary for exercising discipleship, spiritual formation, and discipline as believers in Christ. Last thing I'll say, here's a prescription, because that anybody can do maybe before the day's over. If you want, so there are things we want to do. People say, oh, if you have free will, why don't you stop sinning? And like, that's dumb. That's not what free will necessitates. That's okay. Hold on. Let me backtrack, because my filter also goes away when my medicine starts to wear off. In order to be able to control the things that we can't currently control, we have to develop our will and start at the things that we can control. And here's what I mean. So let's say, someone has, let's say there's a believer who's struggling with something like pornography or those kind of addictions that are more, you can hide behind closed doors, so to speak. and they want to stop that. They literally want to, desire to, maybe even will to, but they find that they can't. Well, you have to start, and this applies to anything, you have to start in the areas where you can control your will in order to build up that strength of will to be the kind of person who can stop these things. And I'm going to try to keep it brief because I'll start preaching here. So
yeah, and we are kind of out of time, so definitely do.
So here's a quick example. If you go to the grocery store, you put your groceries in your car. Don't put the grocery cart behind my car so I can hit it. What you do is, even though your body doesn't want to, your body wants to just leave, you grab the grocery cart, find where they go, and you put it back there. Because again, you're teaching your body, you're going to do what I want you to do, even if you don't want to. And it's a way of controlling what you can control in order to get to the point to where you can eventually get to a place where you can have perhaps better control of the things that you currently cannot. And that takes free will, which takes something like a soul.
Okay. Well, I wish we could keep talking, but we're kind of out of time. For those keeping track along with me, the dad joke count is 5.5. Also, we have all kinds of interesting witty banter happening on Facebook, but I thought I would let you know that Roger Sharp said he lists a book by J.P. Moreland, The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. He says, all proceeds go to Eric's son as he grows into a tree. Because you said the thing about the acorn. Anyway, if anybody
Roger.
that's listening, what's that?
He's a sharp guy. I said, I love Roger.
Oh, sharp guy. Okay, make that 6.5 dad jokes between you and Roger. Woo,
we do share
okay.
dad jokes every now and then. He'll send me stuff.
I am sure.
Great.
If you're listening to this either now live on Facebook or on the podcast later on, and you think that you might be or know someone that could debate Eric, holler at us at Theology on Air, Theology on Tap. I'm going to tell you where to find us in a second, and maybe we can set up a debate about how you can we prove that the soul exists. But give us one more time the website where people can learn more about you or find you or contact you.
Well, you can go to my website, erichernandezministries.com, but where I am most active is on YouTube, where I post my videos, and you can youtube.com/Eric Hernandez, and you can find a lot of stuff I've done on there.
Awesome. And were you going to say something, Evan?
I was just going to ask if he's worried about YouTube taking him down, since they're obviously not substance dualists. So censorship and all.
Yeah, no, yeah. I don't know. We'll see. They have, anyways, demonetized some videos, which I don't know why, but yeah, it's a funny thing that YouTube.
Well, for those of you that are enjoying this, keep checking out the rest of our podcasts on Theology on Air. If you're interested in checking out one of our events with Theology on Tap, you can either go to facebook.com/Theology on Tap Houston, or you can check out our new and shiny, fancy, exciting website, which is HoustonTOT.com. HoustonTOT.com. And until we see all of you next time, I encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed. And that's the show. Eric, thank you so much for doing this. I admit I'm probably going to have to listen to the whole thing again to really take it all in, because it was a lot, especially at the beginning. And you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Are we still on Facebook?
We still are on Facebook. Don't say anything dangerous. Do you want to take it off?
I don't know.
I figured they might want to hear our after banter. Like, oh, those idiots on Facebook. No, I'm kidding.
No, I just didn't know if you're like, oh, thanks for the show. Then, repeat your question. I'm sorry.
There wasn't a question. I was just saying I'm going to have to listen again because it was a lot of information, and it was a little overwhelming at the beginning. So
yeah, and it's. I mean, with these kind of things, it usually is, and I find it best just kind of jump. Like it's like there's people who kind of dip their foot in the water and then kind of slowly get in. I've always been the kind of person that just jumps right in and just gets it over with, and then once you're there, okay, now we're here, so let's deal with it. So
yeah. Awesome. Well, yeah, let's have you back on soon. And I'd love to hear you prove the existence of the soul. And if it's a debate, then I can sit back and just eat popcorn and enjoy. Any final thoughts, Evan, before we say goodbye?
No, good to see you again, Eric.
Oh, likewise.
I still want to have you here for a debate on Molinism, but we'll work on it another day. It's hard to get people to fly to fly much of anywhere these days. So we'll see. Still working on it.
Maybe we can get William Lane Craig to come on the show. I don't think that should be hard, right?
No, probably not. I mean, I think you would come on, but yeah, and I won't mention the name, but I know Evan, you had mentioned someone, some prominent person to do that. I'd still love to, and I just want to publicly even just say a thank you to Evan. So I did a debate in 2015 with Matt Dillahunty on the Soul, and Evan was the one who hosted that, and it's in large because of Evan that I am where I am at today. Before the show,
Aw.
he said his fourth episode was what he had me on his as the fourth episode, and it was actually on the Soul, which sparked interest, and that debate happened with Dillahunty, and which of course got me a lot more, exposure, and he would have me on the show multiple times. And I mean, thanks, Evan. I appreciate your friendship and what you do, and I'll have to give you a gift card or something as a thank you for.
I was going to say, you can show your appreciation to Evan by sending money into Theology on Air. We will take that. And that's how we'll pay William Lane Craig. It'll be a whole thing.
Yeah.
Anyway. Okay. Well, I'm going to go do the things that I've got to do, but thank you so much. And y'all have a great day.
Thank you. Bless your soul.